Martin Gardner was an American popular mathematics and popular science writer, with interests also encompassing micromagic, scientific skepticism, philosophy, religion, and literature, especially the writings of Lewis Carroll and G.K.Chesterton. Gardner was best known for creating and sustaining general interest in recreational mathematics for a large part of the 20th century, principally through his Scientific American Mathematical Games columns from 1956 to 1981 and his subsequent books collecting them. He was an uncompromising critic of fringe science and was a founding member of CSICOP, an organization devoted to debunking pseudoscience, and wrote a monthly column from 1983 to 2002 in Skeptical Inquirer, that organization's monthly magazine. He also wrote a puzzle tale column for Asimov's science fiction magazine from 1977 to 1986 and altogether published more than 100 books. Biography. Youth and education. Gardner, son of a petroleum geologist, grew up in and around Tulsa, Oklahoma. He showed an early interest in puzzles and games, and his closest childhood friend, John Bennett Shaw, later became the greatest of all collectors of Sherlockian memorabilia. He attended the University of Chicago, where he earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy in 1936. Early jobs included reporter on the Tulsa Tribune, writer at the University of Chicago Office of Press Relations, and caseworker in Chicago's Black Belt for the city's Relief Administration. During World War II, he served for 4 years in the U.S. Navy as a yeoman on board the destroyer Escort-us Pope in the Atlantic. His ship was still in the Atlantic when the war came to an end with the surrender of Japan in August 1945. After the war, Gardner returned to the University of Chicago. He attended graduate school for a year there, but he did not earn an advanced degree. In 1950 he published an article in the Antioch Review entitled The Hermit Scientist, a pioneering work on what would later come to be called pseudoscientists. It was Gardner's first publication of a skeptical nature, and 2 years later it was published in a much expanded book version, In the Name of Science, his first book. Early career. In the late 1940s, Gardner moved to New York City and became a writer and designer at Humpty Dumpty magazine, where for 8 years he wrote features and stories for it, and several other children's magazines. His paper folding puzzles of that magazine led to his first work at Scientific American. For many decades, Gardner, his wife Charlotte, and their 2 sons lived in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, where he earned his living as an independent author, publishing books with several different publishers, and also publishing hundreds of magazine and newspaper articles. Appropriately enough, given his interest in logic and mathematics, they lived on Euclid Avenue. The year 1960 saw the original edition of his best-selling book ever, The Annotated Alice, various editions of which have sold over 1 million copies worldwide in several languages. Gatherings for Gardner. Gardner was famously shy and declined many honors when he learned that a public appearance would be required if he accepted. However, in 1993 Atlanta puzzle collector Tom Rogers persuaded Gardner to attend an evening devoted to Gardner's puzzle-solving efforts, called Gathering for Gardner. The event was repeated in 1996, again with Gardner in attendance, which convinced Rogers and his friends to make the gathering a regular event. It has been held since then in even-numbered years near Atlanta, and the program consists of any topic which could have been touched by Gardner during his writing career. The event's name is abbreviated to G4GN, with N being replaced by the number of the event. Gardner attended the 1993 and 1996 events. Retirement and death. In 1979, Gardner and his wife Charlotte semi-retired and moved to Hendersonville, North Carolina. Gardner never really retired as an author, but rather he continued to do literature research and to write. especially in updating many of his older books, such as Origami, Eleusis, and the Soma Cube. ISBN 978-0-521-73524-7, published 2008. Charlotte died in 2002. Years later, Gardner returned to Norman, Oklahoma, where his son, James Gardner, was a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma. He died there on May 22, 2010. An autobiography, Undiluted Hocus Pocus. The autobiography of Martin Gardner was published posthumously. Views and interests. I just play all the time and am fortunate enough to get paid for it. Martin Gardner. 1998. Recreational mathematics and mathematical games. For over a quarter-century, Gardner wrote a monthly column on the subject of recreational mathematics for Scientific American. It all began with his freestanding article on hexaflexagons, which ran in the December 1956 issue. Flexagons became a bit of a fad, and soon people all over New York City were making them. Jerry Peel, the SAR publisher at the time, asked Gardner, "Is there enough similar material to this to make a regular feature?" Gardner said he thought so. The January 1957 issue contained his first column, entitled Mathematical Games. Almost 300 more columns were to follow. The Mathematical Games column ran from 1956 to 1981 and was the first introduction of many subjects to a wider audience, notably flexagons, the game of hex, the Soma Cube, the Three Prisoners problem, polyominoes, the paradox of the unexpected hanging, Wahida tiles, the game of hare and hounds, the superellipse, pentaminoes, the mathematical art of M.C. Escher, fractals, Conway's game of life, Newcomb's paradox, tangrams, Penrose tilings, public key cryptography, Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach, the monster group. Gardner had problems learning calculus and never took a mathematics course after high school. While editing Humpty Dumpty's magazine, he constructed many paper folding puzzles, and this led to his interest in the flexagons invented by British mathematician Arthur H. Stone. The subsequent article he wrote on hexaflexagons led directly to the column. In the 1980s, the Mathematical Games column began to appear only irregularly. Other authors began to share the column, and the June 1986 issue saw the final installment under that title. In 1981, on Gardner's retirement from Scientific American, the column was replaced by Douglas Hofstadter's Metamagical Themes, a name that is an anagram of Mathematical Games. Many of the games columns were collected in book form starting in 1959 with the Scientific American Book of Mathematical Puzzles and Diversions. Over the next 4 decades, 14 more books followed. Donald Knuth called them the canonical books. Pseudoscience and Skepticism. Gardner's uncompromising attitude toward pseudoscience made him one of the foremost anti-pseudoscience polemicists of the 20th century. His book Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science is a classic and seminal work of the skeptical movement. It explored myriad dubious outlooks and projects, including Fletcherism, creationism, food faddism, Charles Fort, Rudolf Steiner, Scientology, Dianetics, UFOs, dowsing, extrasensory perception, the Bates method, and psychokinesis. This book and his subsequent efforts earned him a wealth of detractors and antagonists in the fields of fringe science and New Age philosophy, with many of whom he kept up running dialogues for decades. Gardner was a relentless critic of self-proclaimed Israeli psychic Uri Geller and wrote 2 satirical exposes of him in the 1970s using the pen name Uriah Fuller. In 2 booklets he wrote showing how purported psychics, such as Uri Geller, do their seemingly impossible paranormal feats. The booklets are Confessions of a Psychic, The Secret Notebooks of Uriah Fuller, and Further Confessions of a Psychic, The Secret Notebooks of Uriah Fuller, both published by Carl Fulves of Teaneck, New Jersey. In 1976, Gardner joined with Carl Sagan, Isaac Asimov and others in founding the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. He wrote a column called Notes of a Fringe Watcher from 1983 to 2002 for that organization's periodical Skeptical Inquirer. These have been collected in 5 books. New Age. Notes of a Fringe Watcher. On the Wild Side. Weird Water and Fuzzy Logic. Did Adam and Eve have navels? A universe is thicker than blackberries. Gardner was a senior CSICOP fellow and prominent skeptic of the paranormal. On August 21, 2010, Gardner was posthumously honored with an award recognizing his contributions in the skeptical field from the Independent Investigations Group during its 10th anniversary gala. Theism and religion. Gardner had an abiding fascination with religious belief. He was a fideistic theist, professing belief in one God as creator, but critical of organized religion. In his autobiography, Gardner stated, "When many of my fans discovered that I believed in God and even hoped for an afterlife, they were shocked and dismayed. I do not mean the God of the Bible, especially the God of the Old Testament, or any other book that claims to be divinely inspired. For me, God is a wholly other, transcendent intelligence, impossible for us to understand. He or she is somehow responsible for our universe and capable of providing, how I have no inkling, an afterlife. I am a philosophical theist. I believe in a personal God, and I believe in an afterlife, and I believe in prayer, but I don't believe in any established religion. This is called philosophical theism. Philosophical theism is entirely emotional. As Kant said, he destroyed pure reason to make room for faith." Martin Gardner, 2008. He described his own belief as philosophical theism inspired by the theology of the philosopher Miguel Paranomino. While eschewing systematic religious doctrine, Gardner believed in God, asserting that this belief cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed by reason or science. At the same time, he was skeptical of claims that any God has communicated with human beings through spoken or telepathic revelation or through miracles in the natural world. He has been quoted as saying that he regarded parapsychology and other research into the paranormal as tantamount to tempting God and seeking signs and wonders. He stated that while he would expect tests on the efficacy of prayers to be negative, he would not rule out a priori the possibility that as yet unknown paranormal forces may allow prayers to influence the physical world. Gardner wrote repeatedly about what public figures such as Robert Maynard Hutchins, Mortimer Adler, and William F. Buckley, Jr. believed and whether their beliefs were logically consistent. In some cases, he attacked prominent religious figures such as Mary Baker Eddy on the grounds that their claims are unsupportable. His semi-autobiographical novel The Flight of Peter From depicts a traditionally Protestant Christian man struggling with his faith, examining 20th-century scholarship in intellectual movements and ultimately rejecting Christianity while remaining a theist. Gardner said that he suspected that the fundamental nature of human consciousness may not be knowable or discoverable, unless perhaps a physics more profound than quantum mechanics is someday developed. In this regard, he said, he was an adherent of the new Mysterianism. Literary criticism and fiction. Gardner was considered a leading authority on Lewis Carroll. His annotated version of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, explaining the many mathematical riddles, wordplay, and literary references found in the Alice books, was first published as The Annotated Alice. A sequel published with new annotations as More Annotated Alice, and finally as The Annotated Alice. The definitive edition combining notes from the earlier editions and new material. The book arose when Gardner, who found the Alice books sort of frightening when he was young but found them fascinating as an adult, felt that someone ought to annotate them and suggested to a publisher that Bertrand Russell be asked. When the publisher did not manage to get past Russell's secretary, Gardner was asked to take the project. The book has been Gardner's most successful, selling over 500,000 copies. Gardner's interest in wordplay led him to conceive of a magazine on recreational linguistics. In 1967 he pitched the idea to Greenwood periodicals and nominated Dimitri Borgman as editor. The resulting journal, Wordways, carried many articles from Gardner. As of 2013 it was still publishing his submissions posthumously. In addition to the Alice books, Gardner produced annotated editions of G.K.Chesterton's The Innocence of Father Brown and The Man Who Was Thursday, as well as of celebrated poems including The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Casey at the Bat, The Night Before Christmas, and The Hunting of the Snark, the last also written by Lewis Carroll. Gardner occasionally tried his hand at fiction of a kind always closely associated with his non-fictional preoccupations. His Roman à clef novel was The Flight of Peter From, and his short stories were collected in The No-Sided Professor and other tales of fantasy, humor, mystery, and philosophy. Gardner published stories about an imaginary numerologist named Drive, Matrix and Visitors from Oz, based on L. Frank Baum's Oz books, which reflected his love of Oz. Gardner was a member of the all-male literary banqueting club, the Trapdoor Spiders, which served as the basis of Isaac Asimov's fictional group of mystery solvers, the Black Widowers. Philosophy of mathematics. Gardner was known for his sometimes controversial philosophy of mathematics. He wrote negative reviews of The Mathematical Experience by Philip J. Davis and Reuben Hirsch and What is Mathematics, Really? By Hirsch, both of which were critical of aspects of mathematical Platonism, and the first of which was well received by the mathematical community. While Gardner was often perceived as a hardcore Platonist, his reviews demonstrated some formalist tendencies. Gardner maintained that his views are widespread among mathematicians, but Hirsch has countered that in his experience as a professional mathematician and speaker, this is not the case. Other views. Over the years, Gardner held forth on many contemporary issues, arguing for his points of view in a wide range of fields, from general semantics to fuzzy logic to watching TV. His philosophical views are described and defended in his book The Whys of a Philosophical Scrivener. Under the pseudonym George Groth, Gardner panned his own book for the New York Review of Books bibliography.